At dawn on August 21, 1942, Colonel Kayaneo Ichiki stood at the edge of a coconut grove on Guadalcanal, the humid air already clinging to his uniform. In front of him lay a shallow creek, barely an obstacle at all, and beyond it the American defensive line. Behind him were 917 Japanese soldiers, men he considered the finest the empire could produce. They were veterans, disciplined, hardened by training and by victory. They had marched across Asia undefeated, and like their commander, they believed with absolute certainty that no Western force could stand against them. Ichiki gazed across the water with confidence. According to everything he had been taught, everything Japanese doctrine promised, the Americans on the other side would not hold. They would break. They always did. Ichiki had studied his enemy before departing. Japanese intelligence had assured him that the United States Marines were soft and undisciplined, products of a decadent, materialistic society. They lacked the warrior spirit, the willingness to die, that defined Japanese soldiers. When faced with a determined assault, they would panic, surrender, or run. That belief was not just Ichiki's, it was shared throughout the Imperial Japanese Army. And yet, within 6 hours, nearly 800 of Ichiki's men would be dead, and the foundations of one of the most dangerous assumptions in military history would begin to collapse. Guadalcanal would become the place where Japan's certainty about American weakness shattered. To understand why Ichiki attacked with such confidence, you have to understand what Japanese military leaders believed long before the war ever began. For decades, Japanese doctrine had been built around the concept of Yamato Damashii, the spirit of Japan. This was not mere patriotism. It was the belief that Japanese soldiers possessed a spiritual superiority that outweighed any material disadvantage. Where Western nations relied on machines, factories, and firepower, Japan believed it relied on will, an indomitable fighting spirit rooted in history, mythology, and devotion to the emperor. That belief traced back to ancient texts like the Kojiki and Nihon Shoki, which described the Japanese people as descendants of the sun goddess Amaterasu. The emperor himself was regarded as divine, a living bridge between heaven and earth. A Japanese soldier did not simply fight for a nation. He fought for a sacred lineage stretching back thousands of years. Death in battle was not tragedy, it was fulfillment. In the early 20th century, this belief seemed vindicated. Japan's stunning victory over Russia in 1905 shocked the world. A smaller Asian nation had defeated a European power through what appeared to be sheer fighting spirit. Russian armies with modern weapons and industrial backing had been humiliated by Japanese soldiers who seemed willing to die without hesitation. The lesson Japanese leaders took from that war was simple and seductive. Material strength meant nothing when faced with spiritual resolve. Will could defeat steel. By the 1930s, this conviction had hardened into unquestioned doctrine. Japanese officers were taught that Western soldiers, especially Americans, were spiritually weak. They came from comfortable societies that valued individual comfort over collective sacrifice. They would not endure hardship. They would not fight to the death. When the pressure became unbearable, they would surrender. Early victories in the Pacific War appeared to confirm everything Japanese planners believed. In the Philippines, American and Filipino forces collapsed within weeks of the Japanese invasion. Fortified positions expected to hold for months fell in days. Bataan and Corregidor became symbols of defeat, not defiance. Tens of thousands of prisoners marched into captivity in one of the worst disasters in American military history. At Singapore, more than 80,000 Allied troops surrendered to a Japanese force half their size, what Winston Churchill would call the worst disaster in British military history. Across Hong Kong, Burma, and the Dutch East Indies, Western forces failed again and again to match Japanese aggression. Even at Wake Island, where a small Marine garrison held out for over 2 weeks, Japanese commanders dismissed the resistance as an anomaly. The Marines had nowhere to retreat. It proved nothing, they believed. The pattern seemed clear. Americans had machines and supplies, but when faced with determined assault, they lacked the will to fight. This belief extended specifically to the United States Marine Corps. Japanese intelligence saw nothing impressive. The Marines were a small force, poorly equipped compared to the Army, with no recent experience against a serious enemy. In 1942, the Marine Corps numbered fewer than 70,000 men and had spent the interwar years fighting obscure conflicts in Central America and the Caribbean. To Japanese planners, they were garrison troops pretending to be soldiers. What those planners missed was the quiet transformation the Marines had undergone in the 1930s. Anticipating a war across the Pacific, Marine officers developed entirely new doctrines for amphibious warfare. They trained relentlessly for contested landings against fortified beaches. They emphasized small unit leadership, initiative, and adaptability, qualities that allowed junior leaders to fight effectively even when plans collapsed and communications failed. That culture would prove decisive on Guadalcanal. Colonel Ichiki embodied everything Japanese doctrine promised. When ordered to retake Guadalcanal after the Marines landed in early August 1942, he saw not a challenge but an opportunity for glory. The Americans had seized an unfinished airfield. They needed to be pushed back into the sea. Ichiki was instructed to wait for the rest of his regiment before attacking, but he saw no reason to delay. His first echelon of 900 men would be more than enough. Waiting would only dilute the honor that should belong to his unit alone. On the American side, Major General Alexander Vandegrift had no idea how completely the Japanese underestimated his Marines. He was too busy struggling to keep them alive. Vandegrift was a veteran of decades of service, but Guadalcanal was unlike anything he or his men had faced. Promised 6 months to prepare, he had been given barely 3 weeks. Equipment was scattered across the Pacific. Intelligence was thin. Rehearsals were disastrous. Many of his men were raw recruits who had enlisted after Pearl Harbor, fueled by anger but lacking experience. When 11,000 Marines landed on Guadalcanal on August 7, 1942, they achieved complete surprise. Japanese defenders fled into the jungle, and by nightfall the Marines had secured the airfield that would soon be named Henderson Field. The landing seemed almost too easy. But the illusion shattered days later when Japanese naval forces annihilated the Allied cruiser screen at the Battle of Savo Island. 4 cruisers were sunk, over 1,000 sailors killed, and the American fleet withdrew, taking with it much of the Marine supplies. Stranded and undersupplied, the Marines dug in around Henderson Field. They survived on captured Japanese rice, scavenged equipment, and sheer endurance. Disease spread rapidly. Malaria and dysentery crippled entire units. Still, they held. On the night of August 19th, Colonel Ichiki landed with his men and marched inland, confident of victory. He did not know that the Marines were ready. Warned by a wounded coast watcher who had crawled through the jungle after surviving bayonet torture, the Americans prepared their defenses. At 1:30 a.m. on August 21st, Ichiki launched his assault across the sandbar at Alligator Creek. Japanese soldiers charged screaming, bayonets fixed, expecting the Americans to flee. Instead, machine guns opened up with devastating precision. Artillery shells slammed into tightly packed formations. The sandbar became a killing ground. The Marines did not run. They fought. By dawn, Ichiki's attack had failed catastrophically. By sunset, nearly his entire force was dead. Marine losses were minimal by comparison. The exchange rate stunned everyone who later studied it. Ichiki burned his regimental colors and died, his reputation destroyed along with his command. Yet even then, Japanese leaders refused to accept the truth. They concluded not that the Marines were formidable, but that Ichiki had simply brought too few men. More would solve the problem. Again and again, that belief led Japanese forces into disaster. At Edson's Ridge, during the October Offensive, and throughout the long grinding campaign that followed. Each time, Japanese soldiers attacked with courage and determination, and each time, Marines met them with discipline, adaptability, and stubborn refusal to yield. Henderson Field held. Japanese casualties mounted. Disease and starvation ravaged those who survived combat. Guadalcanal became known as Starvation Island, a place where Japan's best units were slowly destroyed. By early 1943, the truth could no longer be denied. Japan evacuated what remained of its forces, leaving behind tens of thousands of dead. The campaign had cost Japan irreplaceable soldiers, pilots, ships, and, most importantly, its most cherished belief. Guadalcanal proved that Americans could fight, could endure, and would not break. The Marines who held Guadalcanal did not set out to destroy an ideology. They were hungry, sick, exhausted young men trying to survive. But in doing so, they shattered the myth of Japanese spiritual superiority. From that jungle-covered island, the course of the Pacific War changed forever. Guadalcanal was where the tide turned. Guadalcanal was where the myth died. And Guadalcanal was where everything changed.